All right, ready for another deep dive. This time, it's Nestor, episode 2 of Ulysses.
Oh, Joyce, buckle up, everybody. Diving into Ulysses, well, it's a bit like swimming with the sharks. But, hey, that's why we're here, right? To map those murky waters. And you know what? This YouTube analysis we found, it's a lifeline. Seriously.
I like that, a lifeline. Because even for seasoned readers, Ulysses can feel a tad overwhelming at times.
Bad. It's Joyce. It's like he took all the rules of language, tossed them in a blender, hit puree, and said, there you go, have at it.
True, very true. But hey, that's what makes it so rewarding, right?
Absolutely. It's like wrestling with a genius and somehow, maybe learning a thing or two in the process, even if you end up with a black eye.
Exactly. And this episode, even if you've never touched Ulysses, it grapples with these timeless questions. History, knowledge, identity. We're still wrestling with that stuff today, right?
Oh, 100%. I mean, think about it. This book was published over a century ago, right? And yet it's still relevant, still got us scratching our heads debating meaning. That's the mark of a true masterpiece, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. So, Nestor, we know Ulysses loosely follows the Odyssey, but how's that playing out here?
Okay, so in Homer's version, Telemachus goes to this wise old king, Nestor, looking for info about his dad, Odysseus. But Joyce, he's not one for straight adaptations. He takes that basic idea, that search for knowledge, and flips the script.
How so?
Well, Stephen, our protagonist, he's not exactly getting sage advice from Mr. Deasy, the headmaster.
Yeah.
Think more like a collision of worldviews, a clash of generations, all set against the backdrop of early 20th century Ireland.
Okay, so let's break down these two characters a bit. What makes Stephen tick?
Ambition, that's the first thing. This guy, he's a young intellectual, absolutely brimming with ideas. But he's also deeply conflicted about, well, being Irish.
How so?
He sees Ireland as stuck, mired in what the analysis calls a stupor. Resistant to new thought, clinging to the past. He's frustrated by it.
He's that friend we all have, right? The one who's always challenging the status quo, questioning everything.
Yeah, totally. He's all about pushing boundaries, shaking things up. And this puts him at odds with, well, pretty much everyone, including movements like the Irish Revival, which was huge at the time. He's yearning for something different, a clean break, a chance to forge his own path, as an artist.
Yeah, I get that. So if Stephen's the rebellious artist, who's Mr. Deasy in this equation?
Mr. Deasy.
Yeah.
He's like a walking, talking embodiment of the British Empire, at least in Stephen's eyes.
And that's definitely not a compliment coming from him.
Not at all. But here's the thing. It's not just his pro-British stance that's interesting. It's the way he embodies all these contradictions of empire. The analysis points to this line where Deasy says, I always paid my way. On the surface, it sounds straightforward, right? A simple statement of pride.
Right, almost like a badge of honor, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But look closer, right? It's this chilling justification for colonialism when you really think about it. The idea that the British Empire paid its way, it completely ignores all the exploitation, all the suffering inflicted on the Irish people.
That's like saying you paid for a meal when you, ate half of it and left someone else stuck with the bill.
That's a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
The analysis actually makes that comparison. It's like, hey, let's not forget about the other half of this equation.
Yeah.
And speaking of unfair, well, the video also touches upon Deasy's, his views on Jewish people. Let's just say they're very much a product of his time.
Yeah, not exactly what you'd call progressive. And it's important to remember that Joyce isn't endorsing these views. He's presenting them as part of Deasy's character, which adds to this really complex portrait of a man clinging to a worldview that's, crumbling around him.
Exactly. And that's what makes this episode so compelling. You've got this clash of ideologies, this generational divide, all playing out in this really confined space. It's like a pressure cooker of ideas.
So we've got Stephen, who's rebelling against the past, and Deasy clinging to a fading empire. What other themes, symbols should we be watching for in Nestor?
Well, one of the big ones, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is history itself.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Right. Is history this cyclical thing, doomed to repeat itself? Or is it linear, marching towards some grand, preordained goal? And of course, Stephen and Deasy, they've got very different answers to that question. Like, take that line from Deasy about history moving towards one great goal, right? The analysis suggests that Stephen sees that as, well, a bit naive.
Because how can you pin down history to one single goal? It's messy, complicated.
Exactly, this simplification of this huge, chaotic thing. And remember, Joyce himself, he was fascinated by this idea of history as cyclical,
Hmm.
this sense that we're trapped in these repeating patterns, these echoes of the past.
So, are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of history? Is that what he's getting at?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's something that haunts Stephen throughout the book.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And speaking of repeating patterns, the video also digs into this whole recurring motif of cattle in the episode.
Oh yeah, the cattle. I have to admit, I was a little thrown by that at first. What's the deal with all the cows?
It's subtle, but it's so key to understanding the power dynamics at play. So you got DZ, who's super concerned about foot and mouth disease spreading to Irish cattle.
Because, oh, that would be bad for business.
Exactly. Economic devastation. But the analysis wants us to think bigger here, to look beyond the literal cows.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Think of the Irish people themselves as symbolic cattle within the British Empire.
Whoa, okay, I see where you're going with this.
They're seen as this resource, right? To be managed, controlled, exploited, their fate tied to the whims of the empire.
So the cattle represent something way bigger than just, well, cows.
It's this powerful way of showing how colonialism dehumanizes people. It reduces them to commodities.
And Joyce, he was all about exposing those power structures, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He wanted to show how those forces, whether it's colonialism or religion or societal expectations, how they shape our lives. And speaking of shaping lives, let's talk about that riddle Stephen puts to his students.
Ah, yes, the riddle. The analysis made a big deal about that.
Rightfully so. It's this tiny detail that just explodes with meaning.
So break it down for me. What's the significance of this impossible riddle?
Well, Stephen presents his students with this puzzle, right? But it's practically impossible to solve unless you already know the answer. It's like trying to explain calculus to someone who hasn't even learned basic math yet.
Talk about frustration. I can only imagine Stephen's inner monologue during that lesson.
Right. The analysis highlights this sense of Stephen wrestling with the limitations of being a teacher.
You can lead a horse to water, but
you can't make it think. And this ties back into this whole idea of Ireland being stuck in a stupor. It's like they're trapped in that riddle, unable or unwilling to see the solution, even when it's right in front of them.
And that's got to be infuriating for someone like Stephen who's just bursting with ideas.
Totally.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The analysis points out that even though Stephen's critical of this stupor, he's also battling his own demons, his own internal conflicts.
Especially when it comes to his mom, right?
Exactly. He's wrestling with this huge guilt over not fulfilling his dying mother's wish.
Which was?
She wanted him to pray, but he clung to his principles, his rejection of religion.
Talk about a rock in a hard place. On one hand, he's this fiercely independent thinker, right?
Yeah.
Determined to forge his own path. But then he's hit with this weight of grief, of unfulfilled expectations.
And that's the brilliance of Joyce. He shows us how these characters, even the ones who seem larger than life, they're still grappling with these incredibly human emotions.
It's that vulnerability that makes them so relatable, even after all these years.
100%. And this tension, right, between your intellectual ideals and those emotional realities. It's something that runs through all of Joyce's work.
It's what makes him so, well, human. But before we get to the final, very provocative line from this episode, anything else from the analysis we need on our radar?
Well, the analysis, it kind of ends on a cliffhanger, dissecting this really loaded line. And it all ties back to DZ and his views. Remember that anti-Semitic comment he makes towards the end?
Yeah, it's hard to miss. And I kept waiting for Stephen to say something, challenge him on it. But that's not really Stephen's style, is it?
Nope, not at all. And that's what makes this next bit so interesting. Instead of like a direct confrontation, Stephen, he says, I hear the boys in the playground. God is a shout in the street.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly subtle, is he? What's the deal with that line? It feels almost like he's deflecting, but it's such a loaded statement.
That's the million-dollar question, right? What does it mean for God to be a shout in the street? And that's what the analysis really digs into.
So what are some of the interpretations?
Well, is it a rejection of organized religion? Like, God's not confined to some stuffy church, right? He's out there in the thick of it. Or is it more about the chaotic nature of life itself? Like, even the divine, it's caught up in this whirlwind of existence.
Or maybe, and bear with me here, maybe it's Joyce just messing with us, leaving us with more questions than answers.
That's the beauty of Joyce, right?
Yeah.
There's no one right answer. It's an invitation to wrestle with the text, with these big, uncomfortable questions about faith, about doubt, about what it even means to be alive in a world that doesn't always make sense.
It's like he's saying, look, the world is this loud, confusing place, and even something as profound as God, it exists in the thick of it. You can't find all the answers in some dusty old book or in some headmaster's lecture.
And it's the perfect image to end on, especially with the episode called Nestor.
Right.
You got this figure of wisdom, of tradition. But Stephen, he's rejecting that. He's not content with inherited knowledge, with those easy answers.
He's looking for something more, something true to his own experience, even if it means confronting these tough questions about faith, about identity, about what it means to be truly alive in a world that often feels like it's falling apart.
And isn't that something we all grapple with, in a way? How do we find meaning in a world that doesn't always make sense? Where do we fit in all the chaos?
It makes you think about like which shouts we choose to listen to in our own lives, what voices actually resonate with us and all that noise.
It's about forging your own path, even if there's no map, no clear destination. And for Joyce, that's where the real adventure lies. Not in clinging to the past, but in embracing the unknown.
So as we emerge from this deep dive into Nestor, we're left with this one lingering question. What truths will you discover as you navigate your own odyssey? What will you create when faced with the shouts in your own street?
What will your story be?
That's something to ponder, isn't it? Until next time, happy